Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you guys very much for tuning back in. Now in my last video I detailed how around the year 2015 women's digital spaces began to be infiltrated and bombarded with certain ideologies. In this video I'm going to attempt to provide you guys with a working summary of what these ideologies are, and I'm going to try to describe how these ideologies began to shape women's perception. Now, the ideologies in question, as I've already mentioned in my last video, consisted of things like feminist theory, critical race theory, queer theory, and the like. It also consisted of things like anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, but we're not going to get into those in this video. But the first three, feminist theory, critical race theory, and queer theory, these three ideologies are all based upon one core ideology, known as critical theory. Critical theory is a product of the Frankfurt School, and it is a school of thought that is preoccupied with analyzing existing power structures and devising strategies to dismantle those power structures and replace them with new power structures. What power structures are those? Well, it depends upon which school of thought we're talking about. These power structures can be rooted in gender, they can be rooted in race, they can even be rooted in sexual orientation. Feminist theorists, for example, are preoccupied with a power structure known as patriarchy. And if you don't know what the term patriarchy means, the best way to get a working definition of that term is to read feminist theory literature and pay attention to the context in which the term itself is being used. You will find that the term patriarchy is more or less a universal code term used to denote men, male power, male hegemony, and even to a certain degree, male identity. And if you're wondering what the term hegemony means, it's in a sociological context, hegemony is a word used to denote dominance, but not dominance in the sense that you might be thinking. A good example of male hegemony, let's say that you have a company where the culture is very masculine and the culture of the company is centered around accommodating masculinity in men, and 85% of the leadership of the company is male. Feminist theorists would regard that as male hegemony within the company, and they would seek to undermine that. Critical race theorists are preoccupied with a power structure known as white supremacy. And a lot of you old-timers out there, when you hear the term white supremacy, you're probably immediately thinking of hooded men carrying torches on horseback. But that's not what critical race theorists have in mind when they use that term. White supremacy in the context of CRT is a code term used to denote whiteness, white hegemony, or white majority. And a good example of white hegemony in a CRT context, let's say that you have a country where 60% of the population is white, and because that majority, that white majority exists, it begins to manifest itself in the culture. So when you turn on the TV, you see mostly white TV shows, or mostly white films, or mostly white music. That would be regarded as white supremacy in a CRT context. And that's probably a controversial one. There's been a lot of controversy recently over the term CRT, primarily because it's being taught in schools and people are debating that. And one of the biggest arguments I've seen in defense of CRT being taught in schools is that these kids are only being taught about things like the Native American genocide and slavery in the United States. But that's not what CRT is. And, just for the record, I do believe that both of those things should be taught in school, and when I was in school in the 90s, they were. But if teachers are teaching kids CRT, they're teaching that, especially in the United States, they're teaching students that white hegemony is bad, and even to a degree that whiteness is bad. Queer theorists are preoccupied with a power structure known as heteronormativity, and heteronormativity is a term used to denote heterosexual hegemony. In a nutshell, queer theorists believe that heterosexuality has always been regarded as normal by society, and they believe that that attitude marginalizes homosexuals. So they seek to challenge it, and one of the main ways that they challenge it is by increasing the representation of homosexuals in media and elsewhere. That's the real reason why they lobby so hard for increased representation in films and in media. They want homosexual lifestyles to be portrayed as often as heterosexual lifestyles as a way to normalize that and to change public perception in regards to homosexuality. Hope that makes sense. Oh, are we still filming? One thing I want to make a quick note of, anytime I use the term patriarchy on this channel, or almost anytime I use the term patriarchy, I will be referring to it within the feminist theory context. And the definition differs than the conventional definition of the term patriarchy. Same goes for white supremacy. We all know what the term white supremacy means. It denotes racist white people who believe their race is superior and who seek to marginalize or oppress other people based upon skin color or whatever else. But that is not what white supremacy means in a CRT context. And it's really unfortunate that they've chosen to go with that term to denote such a concept, because it takes the impact away from the term itself, especially as the CRT understanding of that term becomes more normalized in our society. Another thing, when you hear proponents of queer theory throw the word homophobia around, it doesn't mean what you think it means. Anytime you hear the term homophobia, you're inclined to think of somebody who hates gay people, or if you were to use the literal definition of the term, somebody who is afraid of gay people. But homophobia in a queer theory context denotes anything that insinuates that homosexuality is abnormal. So if you're a person out there and you express your opinion that you don't want your kids to be subjected to homosexual content, that would be regarded as homophobia by people who subscribe to queer theory. One thing that needs to be understood is that all of these ideologies frequently overlap each other. And if you read works on critical race theory, you'll notice that feminist theory concepts are very often integrated into those works. And a lot of critical race theorists are also feminists and vice versa. And a lot of queer theorists are also critical race theorists and vice versa, or feminists. And this isn't just reflected in academia, this is also reflected in the field with the activists. Like your average feminist activist out in the streets is also a proponent of critical race theory. And for all intents and purposes, these ideologies are fused together and attached to the hip and are part of one cohesive whole. And they're all tied together by a concept known as intersectionality. And the best way to explain intersectionality is it's a mode of thought that seeks to analyze the different perspectives from which a person can be marginalized. It's an oppression hierarchy. According to the intersectionality model, if you're a white man in America, you are not marginalized. You're at the tip top of the totem pole. But if you're a white woman, you're marginalized. But if you're a black woman, you're more marginalized than a white woman because you're both black and a woman, and you're marginalized from both of those angles. But if you're a gay black woman, you're more marginalized than a black woman because you're gay, black, and a woman, and you're marginalized from all three of those angles, etc., etc. And intersectionality, the culture of intersectionality encourages anybody who is marginalized in America to come together to dismantle these power structures, to smash patriarchy and smash white supremacy and smash homophobia, etc. Beginning in the year 2015, roundabout by my estimate, these ideologies began to circulate within women's spaces, their private spaces, in the digital realm, and really anywhere women congregated in the absence of men. Now, how were these ideologies circulated? Well, believe it or not, certain organizations in this country began to prop influencers up within these spaces to introduce these ideologies into the conversation and work to normalize them. And you have to understand, in the year 2015, these concepts were totally foreign to most people outside of a university setting. And for women, especially women in places like the American Midwest or the rural South, which is where I'm very obviously from, most women had never been exposed to these concepts at all. And when they were introduced to these concepts, it was kind of like a game changer to them. It totally changed their perception of the world, their relationship with men. It changed their perception of their own identity and men's identity. Almost at the same time that these ideologies began to circulate within women's spaces, certain proposals also began to circulate within women's spaces. Proposals of a future that was female. Proposals that the world was about to change permanently and that women would be at the helm of it. Now, who inserted these proposals into women's spaces? That's what we'll have to cover in another video because it's an extremely complicated topic. But these proposals were timed perfectly to coincide with women's shifting perception of the world and of their identity. And women, because of their exposure to feminist ideologies, they began to view the world as being male-centric and society as being male-centric. Feminist theorists relate the idea that our culture and all of our norms, our laws, our values, and everything else have been molded by men, and they therefore reflect the male perspective, and that our society at large has been centered around male leadership and male headship. It's been a male-centric culture, and feminist theorists have sought to subvert this and replace this with a female-centric culture. And it's this very thought process that began to infect women's minds. And within a short duration of time, women began to believe that this order of the world needed to be subverted. And a lot of you guys, any of you guys who are on social media around late 2015, when all of these women from out of nowhere started demanding equal rights, if you're like me, you're probably really confused and were thinking, what are you talking about? You already have equal rights. You already have equal opportunities. But women were thinking about the male-centric culture. When they said they wanted equality, what they really meant was that they wanted an end to be put to the male-centric culture or patriarchy. Women began to buy into absurd feminist theorism, such as the idea that the feminine gender role was invented by men as a means of oppressing women and to keep them locked in a box, to keep them from going out in society and dominating and climbing the ladder, etc., etc. And if you read feminist theory literature, you'll notice that they have a huge preoccupation with analyzing the male identity and how it's constructed and trying to figure out how male power is constructed and maintained. They believe that the two are intimately interconnected, which they are. They believe that masculinity is an inherently problematic and oppressive force, a dominant force, and they seek to undermine that. They seek to undermine the male identity. But they've also correctly identified the fact that men aren't born, men are made. They're made through a process of socialization. Traditionally, as young men have started to come of age, the older men would integrate them into the workplace and everywhere else, and would start grooming them and socializing them for the roles and responsibilities that come with being leaders and that come with being men. And it's this process which taught boys how to become men. And being a man is a continual learning process. And what feminists have sought to do is to remove men from this socialization process and to remove them from the mentorship of old men and insert themselves into it. Women, for their part, began to believe that men are a privileged class because of this succession process. They believe that because of this process, men have always had everything handed to them, whether it be opportunities or whatever else. And they started to believe that it was time for men to be removed from that process and for women to be inserted into it. Women began to believe that men had already had their chance to lead the world and that from here on out it should now be women's turn. And this is more or less what gave birth to the expression, the future is female. During this time, many women began to hate men and began to view men as inherently oppressive. They began to view white men as inherently evil and oppressive. And renewed conversations began to spark up in regards to things like the Native American genocide or the Holocaust or slavery in the United States. And it was actually influencers who were propped up to spark up these conversations in order to provide a moral justification for the reintegration process that was about to begin, in order to give women primarily a justification in their minds for why this should be. And the message began to circulate in women's spaces that now is our time. And it wasn't only in women's spaces that this message began to circulate, but it was within anybody's spaces who was regarded as marginalized and as part of the intersectional hierarchy. The message began to circulate that now is our time. We are about to dismantle these power structures and replace them with new power structures. During this time, women were encouraged to withdraw their support from men and to go against their natural inclination to support men and to turn this support towards each other and to increase their female solidarity and to build a robust sisterhood, which would be needed in the process of dismantling patriarchy and replacing it with, well, an intergenerational matriarchy. And I didn't want to make that disclosure in this video without properly preheating the oven, But that is the goal here, is to replace patriarchy with an intergenerational matriarchy. The goal is to prop this generation of women up into leadership roles so that they can begin an intergenerational process of passing wealth and opportunities down to their daughters instead of their sons. Hopefully this video has served to give everyone a brief synopsis of what happened during that time. I'll be expounding on all of these concepts and events in much greater detail in the future, but in the meantime, I hope this video serves as a decent enough synopsis. Now, one thing I do want to say, I will be covering some heavy topics on this channel, and I don't want anybody getting the wrong idea, especially you men out there. I don't want you pointing the finger at any of your brothers, because none of this is their fault. Unfortunately, there is no way to articulate and portray what has happened and what is happening in this country without covering all of these concepts in their totality. And it's going to be controversial, but that's not the intent. This channel is not pro-white, it's not pro-black, it's not even necessarily pro-men. This channel, all I'm trying to do with this channel is express what has happened in this country, and to do it as truthfully and as objectively as possible. But with that said, thank you all very much for tuning in again, and I'll see you next time.